Hello and welcome. I'm Asuma Katauka and you are watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. US President Donald Trump has threatened to substantially raise tariffs on India over its purchases and alleged reselling of Russian oil. India has slammed the move as unjustified and unreasonable, stating the US had previously encouraged such imports. Brazil Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes ordered former President Jair Bolsonaro under house arrest in Brasilia on Monday for violating a social media ban during his trial for allegedly plotting a coup. Bolsonaro, who ruled from 2019 to 2022, is now barred from receiving visitors except lawyers and using mobile phones, with police seizing several devices from his home. Colombian court has rejected former President Álvaro Uribe's request for temporary freedom, while he appeals his 12-year house arrest sentence. The 73-year-old, convicted of witness tampering and obstructing justice, is the first former leader of Colombia to be criminally sentenced. Australia will buy 11 advanced warships from Japan's Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in a landmark $6.5 billion deal, marking one of Japan's largest defense exports. Australian Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles has said that the first 3 frigates will be delivered under the contract, making it Australia's biggest defense purchase since the 2023 AUKUS submarine deal. The Israeli military has said a projectile which has been fired from Yemen was intercepted after air raid sirens sounded across Israel. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has announced he will brief the army on an updated plan for the war in Gaza. Hong Kong issued its highest black rainstorm warning as torrential rains shut down schools, courts, hospital wards, and register offices until 11 a.m. local time. The storm comes after deadly flash floods in southern China's Guangdong province that killed 5 people and triggered a massive rescue operation with over 1,300 personnel. Meanwhile, Beijing has now lifted its severe weather alert now after evacuating over 82,000 residents due to heavy rain, but warned of continued risks from natural disasters according to local state media reports. Authorities have urged citizens to remain alert as rainfall threats persist across the region. Remains of 32 people have been discovered in an abandoned house in Irapuato, Guanajuato State, Mexico, according to the State Prosecutor's Office, with 15 victims identified so far. The fragmented and dismembered body parts were found in a plastic bag and were uncovered during a search for missing persons. US President Donald Trump has once again threatened India with harsh tariffs. He claims India is not only buying Russian oil, but also selling it forward. Trump says if elected, he will substantially raise tariffs on Indian goods in response. India has hit back sharply. The Ministry of External Affairs called the criticism unjustified and unreasonable. Spokesperson Randhir Jaiswal said the US had actively encouraged India's Russian oil imports during the early phase of the Ukraine conflict. He added that traditional suppliers had diverted energy exports to Europe, forcing India to find alternatives. India stressed these imports are essential to ensure predictable and affordable energy for its citizens. The government says it will take all necessary steps to protect national interests. Meanwhile, Russia accused the Trump-led US administration of pursuing a neo-colonial policy. Moscow claims Washington is targeting global South countries to maintain its dominance. Now, for this discussion, we are joined by Jaijit Bhattacharya. He's an economist and finance expert, joins us live from New Delhi. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to NewsX World. Now, how should India respond economically and diplomatically to Trump's renewed tariff threats, especially considering its energy security needs?
The point from the Indian government side is that one, why are we only focusing on petroleum imports? Second, if it's only about energy imports, then we should look at energy in totality. And the reason why these 2 points are important is because the European Union continues to import from Russia, and they're importing not just natural gas and petroleum oil, but they're also importing other products like nickel and so on and so forth. If you look at pure energy, the US is actually importing 300 tons of uranium, and that's equivalent to 800 million barrels of oil being imported, which is much more than the energy that India is importing. So, this discriminatory approach towards geoeconomics, towards sanctions, towards what should be bought from Russia and what should not be bought from Russia at the convenience of US and the convenience of EU is what appears to be a thorn in the flesh for the Indian government because it doesn't sound justified. And the Indian government has a responsibility towards its people. Please do keep in mind that one of the reasons why India had the 1991 financial meltdown was because of the Gulf War, which sent the oil prices shooting high up, which then put the extra pressure on the Indian finances. The Indian government just cannot do it, especially when this kind of a policy does not seem to be a level policy for everybody. It seems to be a cherry picked policy, and that doesn't sound right under any circumstances.
And judges now, President Trump's threats reveal about what do they reveal about the shifting dynamics in U.S.-India relations, according to you? How might they affect the broader Indo-Pacific strategic balance too?
I think the US India prism, the relationship prism needs to be looked at in a multifaceted manner. There appeared that India and US are moving closer. That appears to be more of US's hedge against China. If we look, since the time the new administration in the US came over, there seems to be a movement or a drift away from India. We see the US administration rewarding the proponents of terrorism, which is Pakistan, equating the perpetrator of terror with the victim of terror, which was India. So, saying that Pakistan and India are in the same level, having a different set of rules for India when it comes to what needs can be bought from Russia and what cannot be bought from Russia, especially in the context that there is no sanction per se against purchase of oil from Russia. So it's as per international law that India is purchasing oil from Russia, and India is not purchasing oil from Iran for the same reason that there is a sanction against Iranian oil being purchased. So in this complex prism, if we look at it, there seems to be a deterioration in the ties between US and India, and this will also have an impact on the invisible flows that happen, such as flow of students, which leads to about $10 billion of inflows into US, and many other flows that are happening between from US from India into US. All of that will start getting threatened given the current circumstances if that continues and if there is a discriminatory policy against India and a coercion against a sovereign government, there will surely be a deterioration in ties.
And Jajit, now looking at this U.S. shifting U.S. and India relation, could increasing U.S. tariffs on Indian goods significantly disrupt India's export? And what countermeasures can India implement to safeguard its economy?
Again, that's very complex because US is indeed a large market. It's a significant market for India, and therefore trying to find an alternative to the US market in the short run is going to be a challenge. However, India is working very hard in completing its trade deal with EU, which is again about a $20 trillion market. Similarly, it is trying to fashion many more trade deals with other economies, and hopefully that's going to soften the impact of India not being able to access the US market. But having said that, the US has kept out some of the items which are critical for the US. For example, import of barytes, that's very critical for US for drilling oil. and therefore there is no tariff on export of Indian barytes to US. Albeit that may not be the wisest thing to do because India is fast running out of barytes. Similarly, pharma, that's important for the US, that there is no tariff on pharma to keep the cost of pharma low in US in the short run. But again, that might change moving forward. So it's very interesting and complex unfolding that's happening. It is challenging for India. In the medium term, for sure, India will find other markets. The pain will be in the short run, and it will impact thousands of people who will probably end up losing their jobs because of this shift that's going to happen.
Thank you very much, Jayajit Bhattacharya, for joining us today and sharing your insight as an economist and finance expert. Now we move on to our next news. Brazil's Vice President Geraldo Alckmin has announced that 45% of Brazilian exports to the United States have been excluded from the new tariffs imposed by US President Donald Trump. Brazil will face one of the highest US tariff rates in the world, which is set to take effect from August 6th. Trump has raised tariffs on Brazil to whopping 50%, potentially launching a trade war with Latin America's biggest economy. Brazil sells large amounts of beef, coffee, steel, and other products to the United States, exports which are vital to its economy. Let's listen into what Brazil's Vice President Geraldo Alckmin had to say.
45% foi excluído da taxação, 20% está na seção 232, aí é igual para o mundo inteiro, não tem diferença do Brasil para os demais países, dá 65%. E 35% é o desafio de trabalharmos aí para reduzir a alíquota e ou excluir também como os demais setores. Não, nós estamos terminando um trabalho conjunto de vários ministérios, estamos concluindo as medidas do chamado plano de contingência e é questão de dias isso vai estar resolvido. Claro que por nós não teria nenhuma taxação de 50%, até porque não se justifica.
Trump has framed the tariffs on Brazil as retaliation for persecution of former President Jair Bolsonaro, who faces trial over an alleged coup plot following the 2022 election. According to Brazilian officials, these sanctions carry a clear political message and could escalate tensions between the two countries. Now we move on. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has called US tariffs that are set to hit certain exports this week as very punitive and said that his country would seek to limit their impact. Let's listen into what South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa had to say.
South Africa is confronted by the immediate and damaging punitive tariffs announced by the United States. While we must act with urgency and purpose to limit the impact of these very punitive tariffs, we must also undertake measures to ensure the resilience of our economy and exports into the future. We will continue our engagements with the United States with a view of normalizing trade relations and generally strengthen bilateral relations.
This comes as South African products exported to the US will be hit by a 30% tariff. From August 7th, South Africa faces the highest rate of tariffs in sub-Saharan Africa. The decision is a huge blow to South Africa, as the US is its second biggest trading partner. South Africa has tried for months to negotiate a trade deal with the US, offering to buy American LNG and invest $3.3 billion into the US in a framework trade deal. But the effort was unsuccessful, even after South Africa made last-minute attempts to improve its offer. Ramaphosa had earlier said that his administration would continue negotiating with the United States. Now we are joined by Ross Feingold. He's a political analyst, joins us live from Taipei, Taiwan. Thank you, Ross, for joining us today. Good to see you. Now, first, looking at Brazil and US, how might Trump's stiff tariffs on Brazil reshape U.S.-Latin America relations?
That remains to be seen. There are a number of countries in Central and South America which the Trump administration, or excuse me, or President Trump himself has a good relationship. El Salvador and Argentina come to mind. There are other countries in South America that have been critical of President Trump. So I would say it's just simply too early to assess what the trajectory of U.S. relations with Central and South America are going to be over the coming 3.5 years that remain in the Trump administration. And even the tariff issue is still somewhat in flux because, notwithstanding the statements from Trump administration officials, I think the Trump administration is still open to negotiation with countries, notwithstanding the implementation of tariffs this week. And that very might will include Brazil. I think there's still a lot of unknowns in how the court case against former President Bolsonaro is going to go. Trump could change his mind. He's done that before on issues of tariffs as well. So what is going to drive U.S. Central South American relations? Is it trade? Is it migration? Is it China's role in the region, which the United States is concerned about? I think it's simply too early to tell.
And Ross, now staying on Brazil and U.S., could this escalating trade tensions between U.S. and Brazil trigger broader economic or political realignments within them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's something to watch. Of course, there's hope for alternative groupings like the BRICS, for example, or bilateral trade agreements between countries. And that's something that Brazil is obviously going to pursue in the coming months and years. There are other regional trade pacts, like here in the Asia-Pacific region, the CPTPP, which some South American countries are in and more might want to participate in. One thing we know, though, is that the traditional multilateral processes and organizations like the World Trade Organization, which really was supposed to facilitate trade, that's off the table. The Trump administration is not really looking to the WTO to solve or to be a problem solver or to help create breakthroughs in trade negotiations. In fact, I think you could say the WTO at the moment is all but dead.
And how can South Africa and Brazil leverage its position within the African Union or for South Africa and BRICS for Brazil to address these challenges with U.S. tariffs?
Of course, they have a lot of hope on a trade relationship with China. The challenge for South Africa is they don't manufacture much. So they might export agricultural or other natural resources, but China has the ability to export an enormous amount of manufactured goods, whether that's consumer electronics, other household products, automobiles. China certainly has an ability to export a lot of products, not just to South Africa, but to other countries in Africa as well. So that's something that South Africa has to be concerned about as it expands the trade relationship with China. Brazil's in a bit more better position. They do have agricultural products that China desperately wants. Of course, China is going to insist on a good deal for China, that they get better access to Brazil for China's exports as well. So yes, they'll be looking to China, both of them, both South Africa and Brazil. Again, they might be looking to other regions or trading partners around the world as well. But they're definitely going to be looking to China. But of course, from an American perspective, the Trump administration is going to say, you need to be very careful about that.
Thank you, Ross, for sharing that. Please stay with us as we come back to you for our next discussion as well. Now, Brazil's former president, Jair Bolsonaro, has been placed under house arrest just days before his trial on allegations of plotting a coup to overturn the 2022 election results. The arrest order came from Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes, who was recently sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury. He accused Bolsonaro of violating restraining orders by seeking intervention from U.S. President Donald Trump. The U.S. State Department has condemned the arrest, calling it a threat to democracy, and warned of consequences for those aiding sanctioned conduct. Bolsonaro's family remains vocal. His son, Senator Flavio, called the arrest revenge for sanctions on the judge. Bolsonaro's lawyers have appealed the decision, denying any violation of court orders. Meanwhile, his supporters held their largest rally in months as tensions between Brazil and the US continued to escalate. Let's listen into what some Brazilians had to say on Bolsonaro's arrest.
Na verdade, eu acharia mais justo se ele tivesse na cadeia. Assim como o Lula ficou, fez coisa errada, vai pra cadeia. Ele
ainda. Mas entendo que ele é uma figura política, tem toda uma pressão também de sei lá, quase metade da população brasileira que vota, né? Então isso tem que ser feito com cuidado. Mas acho absurdo ele ainda estar por aí falando.
Mas ele tinha que ficar preso mesmo, em casa.
Now we are joined by Ross Feingold. He's a political analyst, joins us live from Taipei. Thank you, Ross, for staying with us. Now, with the U.S. State Department condemning the arrest as a threat to democracy, how do you view the tension between judicial independence in Brazil and external political pressures by U.S.?
In the short term, this situation is probably going to get worse. There's clearly an intense personal dislike between President Trump and President Lula. The United States is convinced that this prosecution is just political revenge or political persecution. Brazil is saying that its judiciary is independent. You know, the president and the government of Brazil are saying we don't control what the judiciary does. Although there's been some legitimate concerns about judicial overreach by Brazil's courts in recent years. Most famously, their battle with X, for example, with regard to taking down posts. So compared to other democracies, the judiciary in Brazil does have an enormous amount of authority. However, that's kind of independent from whether or not the charges against Bolsonaro are legitimate. I think we have to wait and see how that court process plays out, what kind of evidence is provided, whether or not it does in fact, or his actions that day or preceding that riot do in fact violate Brazilian law. But one thing is absolutely certain here. The Trump administration on this issue is not going to change its position. There'd have to be some kind of exact action by either the Brazilian executive branch or by the courts to basically end the prosecution, or if he's convicted, to give Bolsonaro a pardon. But when it comes to the politics and the foreign relations or the diplomacy side of this, separate from the trade issues, President Trump and his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, their views are not going to change. They are very, very fixed in viewing this as a political persecution.
Thank you very much, Ross Feingold, for joining us and sharing your insight throughout our news as a political analyst. Now we move on to our next news. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is expected to convene his security cabinet this week to discuss the next phase of the Gaza war. Speaking at a cabinet meeting, Netanyahu reaffirmed Israel's war goals. Let's listen in. Now we move on. According to Israeli media, Netanyahu is now leaning towards expanding the offensive, despite opposition from the military's top brass, including Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir. Reports say the army is against full occupation, but government officials insist combat will proceed even in areas where hostages are held. 50 hostages remain in Gaza, though only 20 are believed to be still alive. Now for this discussion, we are joined by Jim Rice. He's a professor of international law, joins us live from Vigan, Philippines. Thank you, Professor Jim, for joining us today. Good to see you. Now, given the tension and rift between Netanyahu's government and the Israeli military leadership, what does this reflect about the internal divide in Israel now?
Yeah, this is a very interesting development, which is only beginning to occur. Obviously, there are cracks within the leadership, and it kind of indicates what I've been suggesting before, which is that Netanyahu has no motivation whatsoever to end this war. In fact, he wants to continue the war indefinitely. And the reason for that is because his political support depends upon a very fractured coalition of extreme far-right parties that want to essentially depopulate Gaza, and for that matter, depopulate the West Bank as well. So for this group of former officials, military people to come out, writing a letter right now.
Thank you, Professor Jim Rice, for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we come back to you for our next discussion as well. Now, Philippines President Ferdinand Marcos has arrived in New Delhi for a state visit aimed at strengthening bilateral ties between the Philippines and India. He met with India's Foreign Minister Subramaniam Jaishankar and is set to meet Prime Minister Narendra Modi today. The 5-day visit will focus on boosting cooperation in defense, pharmaceuticals, agriculture, and maritime security. A key highlight of this visit is the growing defense collaboration between the two nations. This comes as the Philippine and Indian navies recently conducted their first ever joint exercises in the South China Sea, an area heavily contested by China. This visit marks a significant step in strengthening regional alliances and advancing the Philippines' efforts to safeguard its territorial interest in the South China Sea. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Professor Jim Rice. He's a professor of international law. Thank you, Professor, for staying with us. Now, how do you think this, how significant is this visit by Philippines and India, and do you think it can trigger China regarding seeing them collaborate in things?
Well, I think that this is an important development. I think that this is really good news, both for the Philippines and for India. The reason for this is because China has been a bad actor in this region. And China has been consistently bullying the Philippines, both the military and the fisher folks in this region, intimidating them in our exclusive economic zones in the West Philippine Sea, as we call it here, and disregarding the decision by the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which was handed down in 2016. So what is needed is for major players like India to show, and Japan and the United States to show solidarity with the Philippines in an effort to try and keep China in check in this region. But if you'll ask me a follow-up, I mean, there are even more significant implications for this.
Thank you very much, Professor Jim Rice, for joining us and sharing your insight as a professor. Now we move on. Well, that's all we have time for. We will continue to bring more news updates from around the world.